Greetings from the People's Dispatch studio in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief, your primer on some of the top international news stories of the day. We're talking today about elections in the US, the peace process in the Western Sahara, latest developments from Sudan, and we're getting personal with my co-anchor Prashant on Diwali Eve. First up though, voters in the United States went to the polls on November 2nd to decide a series of races that will test the national political climate and the direction of the Democratic Party a year into Joe Biden's presidency. The most important elections were the race for the governor's position in the states of Virginia and New Jersey, along with mayoral elections in cities such as New York and Boston. There were also a number of local elections and ballot measures, including one in the city of Minneapolis on police reform, which we will be talking about. Prashant, we've talked on the show often of the dysfunctional nature of the political system currently in the US and how both the Democrats and the Republicans are kind of floundering in this post-Trump vacuum, as it were.
Right.
The victory of Glenn Youngkin in the Virginia gubernatorial race, why is that important and what are the wider implications of it?
Right, Siddhant. So first thing, of course, like India for that matter, in some democracies, the US always seems to be having elections. Elections every year.
Yeah.
But now the key thing, of course, is that this is not a major round. Their major round is actually coming maybe in a few months, where a lot of Senate and House of Representative seats, that's the top layer of Congress, they will be up for grabs. So that's the dangerous one, so to speak. But this one, nonetheless, providing some hints. Like you said, there are two angles to it. One are some of the statewide larger elections. There are a lot of local initiatives which have both good and bad messages. We'll talk about some of them.
Yeah.
But the question you asked was specifically about Virginia State. And it's a fairly important state, a big state. And the Republican candidate Glenn Youngkin won. Now, the interesting thing here is this happens just a year after Biden's election. Virginia was a state which Biden had won by a considerable margin. But, the Terry McAuliffe, who was trying to contest for the Democratic candidate, he was trying to portray the Republican candidate as, a Trump Jr. or a Trump lookalike, etc. But what the Republican candidate seems to have done is basically get voters out who are not happy with Trump, but nonetheless were Republican. And so he was able to sort of, win this election. So this is a strategy which, according to many observers, Republicans might follow in the coming months and years as well. So they will show enough affiliation to Trump to get the supporters in, but they'll also put some amount of distance so that people who dislike Trump really badly do not stay away because of this or do not vote for the opponent because of this.
Right.
So this is being seen by mainstream media as the next new great strategy. Now, a lot of these strategies die off halfway through, so we need to really see if it's actually worth something. The important thing, of course, is that the Democrats are in a bit of a crisis. You have to admit it.
Yeah.
And that largely stems from the fact that there has been complete, for lack of better word, chaos in terms of how the Democrats have managed the crisis which Trump left them. The US had a horrible pandemic. It is still having a very difficult pandemic. Unemployment is rampant, huge amounts of poverty, huge amounts of homelessness. The Democrats are technically in control of all the three wings of government, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency.
Right.
But nonetheless, they have not really been able to pass a lot of important legislation which can drastically change the nature US society is structured or how US society works. So for a lot of people who were, really at this, suffering end of the pandemic, of the economic crisis, the Democrats have just come across as dithering, as indecisive, as incapable of addressing a lot of these issues. And this gives, for instance, Republican challengers a twofold advantage. On the one hand, they can continue to claim that they will get XYZ done because, let's be honest, even if their agenda is often vicious, they have a better record of getting it through. So unfortunately. On the other hand, they can also keep using these, dog whistles to racism, to, like, for instance, in the election, there was a lot of discussion about critical race theory, about the role of transgenders, all of which was basically the candidate reaching out to right-wing voters. So that will continue nonetheless. And the Democrats will kind of end up, sounding and looking like this indecisive, neither here nor there force, which is not able to get anything done. So I think that's probably a key takeaway. And right now, there are a lot of Democrats who will say, okay, you know what, we should abandon radical proposals, we should abandon progressive proposals, and we should stick to the medium, to the centrist position. Try to bring everyone along, which never happens, by the way.
And we saw some of that also in the context of the Build Back
Exactly. So, you make compromise after compromise. The point is, all these compromises are not benefiting the voters, they're benefiting corporate interests. And as long as the Democrats refuse to see that, and they keep saying that, what we need is a centrist agenda, they'll just be alienating more people. So I think that's probably the larger takeaway.
Right. So some important measures, though, in terms of local ballot questions being asked, including on defunding the police in places like Minneapolis, where, of course, George Floyd was killed.
Right.
Tell us more about that, please.
Right. So the Minneapolis proposal is very interesting because it sought to replace the police department with a public safety department. It's quite unique. And so what it indicated was that, for instance, if there is an emergency, it's not always the police who will actually come to your door. Sometimes it could be mental health professionals. Sometimes it could be medical professionals. Sometimes it could be police officers. So the idea was also at looking at law and order and social harmony as something more comprehensive, not just something where you send two people with a gun, which is what often happens. And there were a number of instances where especially black youth, some of whom, for instance, have suffered from various issues, have been killed by police officers who are trigger happy. Right. So this is an enduring problem in the United States, as we saw. And in many cases, black people, for instance, who were just sitting in their homes, who were suspected of being criminals or robbers or whatever, and who were often shot. Right. So this was an interesting proposal. It lost, but nonetheless, other proposals managed to win. There's a proposal in Austin, which actually the proposal to increase the the strength of the police department was defeated. Another one which sought to improve more, community standards, I think, won. So actually, I think on the ground there is a shifting of attitudes towards law and order, towards policing and all that, which will probably take a long time before it goes up to the higher levels of the administration. Right now, the slogan "defund the police" is being used by the Republicans, by a section of the Democrat, to beat down any progressive voices who ask for reform.
Right.
So the Republicans say that, oh, these people want to destroy police and create crime. Right, which is again a dog whistle. The right-wing Democrats or centrist Democrats say that, oh, we lose votes if we say defund the police.
Absolutely.
Whereas what the defund the police advocates are arguing is for a wide variety of reforms, which actually make structural change necessary. And this would actually is necessary across the world because police forces, as we know, are pretty much, that's one thing common to everywhere probably. So I think some of these ground level movements, whether they win or not, are interesting because they're the beginnings of a change, which I think over the years will start becoming more and more the norm.
Right, fair enough. We're moving on to the Western Sahara now, a region that we've not really brought up on the show before. The United Nations last week passed a resolution extending the mandate of the UN mission there for the referendum in Western Sahara. Earlier, the UN also appointed a new envoy for the region, Staffan de Mistura. These come nearly a year after Morocco ended the status quo in the region and launched military attacks, breaking the ceasefire. The people of the Western Sahara have been waging a long struggle for self-determination, which continues to this day. Prashant, since we haven't talked about this region before, first, could you paint a picture of the conflict that's ongoing since 1975? Right.
So actually, Western Sahara is one of the main sites of the struggle for decolonization and liberation, which continues to this day. And while, of course, the struggles of the Palestinians are often, much more reported, those of Western Sahara are often not talked about as much, although it's as important, a very significant struggle as well. So the story is pretty brief. Western Sahara was, the Moroccans basically, when the Spanish withdrew in 1975 from that region, they gave that territory, territory that is known as Western Sahara today, to Mauritania and Morocco, whereas from the beginning it was supposed to, it is Sahrawi people who are culturally distinct, who have their own traditions and customs, and who had their right to self-determination, which was a basic question. So at that point, Mauritania soon withdrew in 1979 from that region. Morocco continued to occupy that part of Western Sahara. So today there is actually a region which is under a large part of Western Sahara, which is under Moroccan occupation, and there is a region which is under the Polisario Front, which is the representative of the Sahrawi people. Right. So there was a war from about 1975 to 1990, and there was a ceasefire. So it was this ceasefire that Morocco broke last year, because it sent troops into the Western Sahara region, arrested human rights activists, arrested those who were raising or chronicling these violations, sent massive crackdown over there. This happened in November 2020, and since then the situation has been quite tense. And the people of Western Sahara have been raising. We recently spoke last month to a representative of CODESA, and he had pointed out that the people of Western Sahara have been increasingly and very, very powerfully patient for 3 decades now. And there's been international talk about the need for self-determination, about the need for a referendum, but it's not just been implemented because Morocco is a key strategic player in the region. Their allies, will come to that later. But the key point here is that the aspirations of the Sahrawi people have been trampled on for decades now, right? And the human rights violations, there are many people, for instance, who spent decades in jail. Morocco itself has imprisoned its own citizens who have argued for the self-determination of the Sahrawi people. So Morocco is one of those countries which is, it is run with an iron hand, both internally and as a part of its colonial endeavor on the Sahrawi people. So this has been a very long long struggle. This is one of those struggles which in principle the United Nations and international bodies and countries across the world back.
Yeah.
But the game on the ground is very different.
So since we are talking about the game on the ground, our friends in the United States obviously come into the picture. What are their stakes in the game?
Right, Siddhant. So last year, Donald Trump, while he was still in power, got Morocco into his Abraham Accords package. Now, what is the Abraham Accords? The Abraham Accords were this deal by which certain Arab countries recognized Israel in return for various perks. Now, we know that the UAE signed it, Sudan signed it, we'll be talking about that also. And another key player was Morocco. Now, what Morocco got for recognizing Israel and normalizing ties with Israel was a US recognition of its sovereignty over Western Sahara.
Right.
And this was a violation of everything that is enshrined in international law, a violation of the US position in the past, a violation of UN positions. And this gave the Moroccans a huge amount of legitimacy in their drive in terms of continuing their occupation of Western Sahara. So that was a huge blow to this process. An interesting counter development, although recently, was that one of the major European courts declared that a EU-Morocco deal on fishing and trade was invalid because it actually included the coastal territories of Western Sahara.
Right.
So basically, it said that Morocco did not have any sovereignty over Western Sahara. So that was a major milestone, and it also recognized the Polisario Front as the legal representative of the Sahrawi people. So that definitely, of course, a victory for the people over there. But again, the issue of Western Sahara has been this kind of game which various countries have played. For instance, Morocco and Spain recently had a huge diplomatic battle over the fact that the president of Western Sahara, Ibrahim Ghali, had gone for treatment over there. The Moroccans were trying to arrest him or whatever. So nonetheless, the fact remains that the fate of a lot of the people of Western Sahara has been used as a bit of a table tennis ball or whatever to suit other interests. And Western Sahara, of course, is a lot of human resource and natural resources, fishing, of course, phosphate. So all these issues have actually, contributed to the fact that the region is being seen as just an area to be exploited, and the aspirations of the people are not being met. So for the people over there, it's really a struggle right now because they do have some allies, of course, and this is actually one of those long struggles which many, like I said, are in principle committed to. But nonetheless, the fact remains that for a lot of people over there, increasingly the feeling might be coming up that they are just being used as pawns in a global, regional and strategic struggle. And that is definitely not good for the region as a whole, because when over 30 years or 50 years, your demands, which in principle are accepted by everyone, are not met, then the resistance is only bound to mount, and we might see the effects of this in the following months.
I guess in terms of US politics, also Biden continuing Trump era policy, at least in that sense.
So in many senses, while not declaring active support for many of those policies, he's not withdrawn them either. So, which is what we discussed. On the ground, facts are changing.
Yeah, fair enough. We are moving on now to the Sudan, where reports are coming in of new conversations or negotiations between the army and civilian authorities. The politicians seem to be edging closer to a deal following last week's coup, reports indicate. Negotiations between coup leader Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, former rebel groups, and the removed Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok are on in the capital Khartoum, according to the United Nations, with some reports even suggesting that Hamdok has been agreed to come back and head a new government. Prashant, a strange sort of coup then. What if Hamdok returns? Does it mean that the coup has been reversed, or what?
Oh, not at all, in a sense. Actually, I think this is a fundamental contradiction from the very beginning that we have been seeing in Sudan. The fact that, like we discussed in the past, first of all, the coup by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan was against the transitional government he was heading. Right. So why did he do that coup? Because he was supposed to leave that government, leave that position the next month. Right. That's one part. Two, the part that the feeling from the very beginning was that the military was, for the military, at least among military circles, there was a feeling that they were not probably in as much control as they would have liked to be. Right. So there was too much of, even the
civilian interference.
Yes, so what they call civilian interference. So our understanding is that from the very beginning, the military's attempt has not necessarily been to completely take over, but to sort of create a puppet government. In fact, Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, after coming to power immediately, one of the first things he said that a technocratic government would be put in place. Now, what is a technocratic government? A technocratic government is a government led by people who really have no popular support and who are technocrats. So that really is the idea of the military, probably to have some kind of a civilian phase, but wield all the power, which
so
is pretty much
administrators,
which is pretty much what they were even doing before.
Right.
But there was always the possibility that this transitional system, where the government and civilians had equal, in principle, equal share, could be used to reverse the gains of the military and become full-fledged civilian, so to speak. So I think that the coup was a preemptive strike by the military to actually end all possibilities of any kind of civilian resurgence and to reduce civilian participation to a purely symbolic or ceremonial role or a nominal role. There is a civilian in charge, but who wields the power is a question. And in this context, it's really important to note that most international organizations, most international key countries such as the United States, all of them have demanded the return of the transitional government. So, for instance, Handok, who was heading the transitional government, comes back. So technically, that demand is met. So there's no need for sanctions, etc., according to the international community. But this is really the key point here, that the return or this kind of a negotiation or deal, if it is struck, it is likely that all this is going to do is further enshrine the power of the military and reverse the gains of what is called the December Revolution of Sudan, where protests broke out in 2018, overthrew Omar al-Bashir, the former president, in 2019, and actually managed to create a strong foothold for a progressive system.
People have been consistently out on the streets. So what is the position of the protesters?
Right. So like I said, the December Revolution, which we talked about, which began in 2018, peaked in 2019, continued after that. Was one of the key organizations was the Sudanese Professionals Association. That's a confederation of trade unions, people's movements, etc. So they, especially after the coup, have been very clear that their demand is not for the return of Hamdok or a return of the transitional government. Their demand is for full civilian rule. And the people who took to the streets immediately after the coup, there was a huge march across the country on October 30th. People's Dispatch has done a detailed report on it. 3 people are believed to have been killed, many more unverified casualties. Massive protests across the country. These protesters also demanded the same, that they want full civilian rule. And there is some amount of resentment and anger at the fact that their demands are being misinterpreted as a return to
the status quo.
To a status quo, just nominal civilian rule. So they're very clear, and there's a variety of demands. It's a return to full civilian rule, say a proper structures which can try some of the army generals who are accused of crimes against the people of Sudan, a progressive economic policy which can actually deal with the nature of the economic crisis, the divestment of the army from key sources of the economy. The army controls a massive amount of Sudan's economy, which is actually not a very well-known fact. So the divestment of the army from those kinds, a progressive foreign policy where Sudanese people are not sent as mercenaries to fight maybe in Libya or fight in Yemen, and for that matter, Sudan's close links with Israel. We talked about the Abraham Accords. Sudan was another country which signed those records, and again, that was part of the military's decision, So all these are like clear demands that the radical sections, the protesters on the streets are making. So from what information we've got, they are not in a position and they are not willing to buy this kind of deal. Now, it remains to be seen what will happen, because I suspect by the time the show goes up as well, we'll probably have much more clearer news. There'll probably be details of the government. But my hunch as of now is that this still will not be acceptable to the people of Sudan.
And of course, that's something we'll be covering closely as things develop. But it's a rare situation on Daily Debrief where we have a day off actually tomorrow. So you will not see us at the regular time tomorrow, because it's the festival of Diwali that is celebrated in India. It's a national holiday here. It's also referred to popularly as the Festival of Light. I was trying to come up with a joke to sort of lighten the mood, but unfortunately that was going a bit dark. So instead we thought we'd get a bit personal with Prashant and ask him a little bit about his hopes and dreams.
That's a tough question to ask a journalist. You never do that.
So firstly, tell me, a day away from the newsroom, are you having palpitations yet?
I probably will just be, spend time, end up reading the whole day. That's what journalists usually do. Warning.
So what are you? It's kind of like a New Year festival as well here in India. what are you looking forward to from a political or a news standpoint in the next
Right,
few
Siddhant. I
weeks
mean,
and months?
from People's Dispatch, as far as People's Dispatch is concerned, what we often do is spend time covering movements and progressive actions and people's struggles across the world. So that's really our day-to-day work, so to speak.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, I would point to one or two things. One is the farmer struggle in India. That's going to complete 1 year this month. That's
Right.
towards the end of November. It's been a historic struggle. Please do watch and read People's Dispatch if you're not seen it, to actually see what a massive struggle it has been across the country, across the year. People spending months away from their homes, sitting on the streets, setting up kitchens, setting up libraries, in demand that their livelihoods be protected.
Yeah.
So, really one thing to look forward to, how towards the end of November they're going to mark that year, what fresh directions they're going to take. One, that's definitely an interesting thing. Two, from Latin America, where we often talk about a host of elections coming up in Venezuela, a very important election process, which could mark a fresh step in reconciliation, a fresh step in stability, a fresh step in people, who have been divided using foreign interference. There have been attempts to divide the people using foreign interference. So that some of these gaps actually be bridged. Similarly, in Chile, which has suffered from the brunt of, the worst kind of exploitation by new finance international institutions. There is a hope that a more progressive government will come. The government which beat down, brutalized protesters over the past years, that it might, what happens to it remains to be seen. But there might be a fresh page as far as Chile is concerned. So definitely one thing to look forward to. I definitely count Sudan as one of those factors as well. The protests have been a very inspiring thing to watch over the past 2 years.
Right.
And since as we are entering the third year, as we are reaching the third anniversary, definitely a massive thing to watch out for. And obviously, I think the struggles of the people of Palestine, always important to sort of, the remarkable resilience they show.
Yeah.
Despite the international community, despite Israel's brutal policies, beating them down again and again, the fact that there is so much continuous resistance on the ground, always inspiring and interesting to watch. So I would say that across the world, wherever people are on the streets, wherever people are on the streets, there's always hope.
Yeah, for sure. And on that note, I mean, we'll come back from our day break also with renewed sense of energy and looking at all of these stories. You've been watching Daily Debrief. That'll do it for us on the show today. We'll be back on Friday with another episode of the show. Until then, you can follow up on all of these stories on peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on all our social media channels as well. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. Goodbye.